Perfection, I've learned, is a matter of lighting. It's a carefully constructed stage, a meticulous arrangement of props and backdrops, all illuminated by a soft, forgiving glow that smooths over the cracks and conceals the dust. From the outside looking in, my life was a masterpiece of set design. I had a thriving business, a consulting firm I'd built from the ground up on a foundation of logic and relentless efficiency. I had a beautiful wife, a woman who seemed to generate her own light. And we had a social circle that orbited us like planets around a binary star, a constellation of envy and admiration. But perfection is a fragile illusion. Turn up the house lights, and you see the truth, the chipped paint, the frayed edges, the flimsy reality behind the facade. Behind the smiles and the carefully curated Instagram posts, our life was not a masterpiece. It was a stage play in its final, disastrous act, the actors forgetting their lines, the scenery beginning to wobble. Vanessa and I had been a unit for 6 years, married for 4. When we first met, she was a magnetic force, a whirlwind of ambition and laughter, and a life force so potent it felt like it could power a small city. She had an energy that bent the very physics of a room, drawing all light and attention toward her. I, a man who thrived on routine and the quiet, predictable certainty of a well-executed plan, was drawn to her chaos like a moth to a supernova. I thought her fire would warm me. I never imagined it would one day threaten to incinerate me. Back then, she wasn't the influencer she is today. That word, with its hollow, commercial sheen, didn't exist in our vocabulary. She was just Vanessa, a woman with dreams as vast and luminous as a desert sky, and a laugh that could make you believe in things like destiny and soulmates. But somewhere along the line, the signal degraded. The change was not a sudden cataclysm. It was a slow, creeping erosion, the kind that happens over years, imperceptible from one day to the next. Her passion for sharing her life, for connecting with people online, began as a hobby. It grew into a passion, and then, with a frightening, exponential velocity, it swelled into an all-consuming career. At first, I was her biggest champion. I watched, with a genuine sense of pride, as her follower count ticked upward, from a few hundred to a few thousand, then tens of thousands. Brands, once distant and aspirational, began to notice her. Sponsorships, collaborations, invitations to exclusive events, they poured in, a deluge of validation. She was thrilled, her eyes alight with a feverish, triumphant glow. And I was happy to be the supportive husband, the steady, quiet bedrock upon which she could build her glittering empire. But as her platform grew, so did the performance. Our life ceased to be something we lived, it became something we produced. Our once intimate dinners, full of easy conversation and shared silences, became photo ops. The food would grow cold as she arranged the plates for the perfect flat lay, the candlelight reflecting in the dark, unblinking lens of her phone. Conversations about our future, about children, about travel, about the quiet, shared dreams that are the mortar of a marriage, were replaced by her breathless plans for the next big post, the next brand partnership, the next viral trend. And then there was the audience, a vast, invisible, and ever-present third party in our marriage. A million disembodied eyes for whom every moment had to be curated, every emotion calibrated for maximum engagement. Everything she did, every decision she made, seemed to be filtered through the lens of their potential reaction. Their validation became the only currency that mattered. My opinion, my happiness, became secondary. "You should smile more in the photos, Ethan," she'd say, her voice a director's command as she physically positioned my head for another candid shot that was anything but. People love to see us happy. Us happy star. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I didn't notice the cracks right away. Or maybe I did, and I chose to ignore them, plastering them over with the convenient excuses of a man who does not want to face a difficult truth. Vanessa had always been headstrong, ambitious. I told myself this was just a phase, a temporary obsession that would eventually recede. But the phase hardened into a pattern, and the pattern calcified into a reality I could no longer escape. She started hosting more events. Dinners, parties, networking mixers, all under the guise of building her brand. I tried to keep up. I tried to be the supportive husband, the charming plus one. But no matter how wide I smiled, how many hands I shook, or how many times I allowed her to position me as the perfect, adoring accessory for her audience, I felt a profound and growing sense of dislocation. I was a prop, a well-dressed, smiling prop in the elaborate stage play of her life. The woman I had fallen in love with, the woman with the infectious, unself-conscious laugh, had been replaced by a stranger. A beautiful, successful, and utterly hollow stranger. And I had no idea how to bring her back. One evening, I came home late from a brutal day at the office, my mind a tangled mess of spreadsheets and client demands. I walked in, craving the simple, quiet comfort of my own home. But the house was not quiet. Her voice, and the voice of her best friend Monica, echoed from the living room. They were on a video call, their faces illuminated by the laptop screen. I stood in the hallway, just out of sight, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. They were laughing about something, a high, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "You should have seen Ethan last night," Vanessa said, her tone a masterclass in playful condescension. "He looked so lost at that dinner. Poor guy. He just doesn't have that spark, you know." Monica laughed, a sound of easy, cruel agreement. My chest tightened. It felt as if a cold, heavy hand was squeezing my heart. I stood there, a ghost in my own home, listening as my wife discussed my inadequacies with her friend as if I were a disappointing new hire, an acquaintance she was forced to tolerate. "He's great," Vanessa added, a clumsy attempt to soften the blow. "He's steady. But sometimes I just wish he'd step up. Be a bit more manly." The words were a physical blow. I didn't confront her. The energy for a fight simply wasn't there. I just retreated, silently, and went to bed. I lay there for hours, staring at the dark ceiling, her words replaying in my head, each repetition another turn of the knife. Asterisk no spark. Not manly. Asterisk. The next morning, I tried to talk to her. I approached her as she was getting ready, a whirlwind of makeup brushes and hairspray. "Do you really think I'm not enough for you?" I asked, my voice steady, but the question itself a raw, vulnerable thing. She paused, looking at my reflection in the mirror. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes guarded. "It's not that you're not enough, Ethan," she said, choosing her words with the careful precision of a politician navigating a hostile interview. I need someone who matches my energy. Someone who can keep up with me." "Keep up with you?" I repeated, a bubble of long-suppressed frustration rising to the surface. "Vanessa, I have supported you every single step of the way. I have stood by you through all of this. I have been your rock. What more do you want from me?" She sighed, an exasperated sound, and brushed past me to grab her phone from the nightstand. "It's not about what I want from you, Ethan," she said, her attention already on the glowing screen. "It's about what you're willing to give." The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered, a toxic, invisible gas filling every room of our house. Every interaction felt heavy, every smile forced. I started to question everything. Myself. Our marriage. Whether this elaborate, empty performance was worth fighting for anymore. Looking back, I realized that was the beginning of the end. Vanessa's world was built on the fragile scaffolding of appearances, and I had become just another piece of the set dressing. But I knew, deep down, that something had to give. I couldn't keep living in her shadow, pretending to be the man she wanted for the cameras. I had to find a way to reclaim myself, even if it meant bringing the whole stage crashing down around us. The moment Vanessa invited Jacob into our lives, I should have seen him for what he was, not a mentor, but an accelerant. He was the gasoline she poured on the smoldering embers of our marriage. He was everything I wasn't, and everything she had convinced herself she needed. He was flashy, charismatic, and he dripped with a kind of predatory confidence that demanded attention. He was the kind of man who could command a room with a lazy smirk and a single, raised eyebrow. And Vanessa, my ambitious, validation-starved wife, drank him in like a fine, expensive wine. I first heard his name during one of her late-night, breathless recaps of her day, her eyes shining with the fervor of a new convert. "Jacob is brilliant, Ethan. Absolutely brilliant. He's been in the industry for years. He knows everyone. He's the one. He's the person who can take my brand to the next level." At first, I didn't think much of it. My role, as I saw it, was to be supportive. If this Jacob character could help Vanessa achieve her dreams, then who was I to stand in the way? But as the weeks bled into months, Jacob's name became a constant, intrusive presence in our home. He was the ghost at our dinner table, the third voice in every conversation. The first time I met him in the flesh was at one of Vanessa's networking events. Our house was transformed into a throbbing, pulsating organism of ambition. It was packed with other influencers, their faces a blur of perfect teeth and practiced smiles, photographers documenting every authentic moment, and brand representatives circling like sharks. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, champagne, and desperation. I had spent most of the evening playing my designated role, the handsome, supportive, and largely silent husband. I nursed a drink, trying to stay out of the way, a piece of living furniture, while Vanessa worked the room like a seasoned pro. And then, Jacob arrived. He didn't just enter the room, he conquered it. He waltzed in as if he owned the place, his voice a booming, confident baritone that cut through the chatter. He went straight for Vanessa, greeting her with a hug that was a little too long, a little too familiar. "Vanessa, my star," he exclaimed, holding her by the shoulders and looking her up and down with an appraising, almost proprietary, gaze. "You are absolutely glowing tonight." "Jacob," she laughed, a high, girlish sound, as she lightly touched his arm. "I'm so glad you could make it." A few moments later, she dragged him over to me. "Jacob, this is my husband, Ethan." He extended a hand. His grip was firm, a subtle assertion of dominance. His smile was just a little too smug. "Ethan, great to finally meet you. Vanessa talks about you all the time." "Good things, I hope," I replied, forcing a smile of my own. "Of course," he said, his tone as smooth and insincere as a timeshare salesman's pitch. "She's always saying how supportive you are. It's a rare thing, you know, to find a partner who can handle being in the shadow of such a powerhouse." The words were a perfectly crafted insult, gift-wrapped as a compliment. He said it with a grin, as if we were all in on the joke. The joke, of course, was me. The underlying message was brutally clear. Vanessa was the star, and I was the dim, insignificant planet lucky enough to be caught in her orbit. Over the next few weeks, Jacob ceased to be a visitor in our lives and became a permanent resident. Late-night strategy calls, long lunch meetings, and even weekend brainstorming sessions began to fill her calendar. Her very aesthetic began to change. Her wardrobe, once a mix of classic elegance and comfortable chic, was suddenly full of sharp, architectural blazers and bold, aggressive colors. "Jacob's suggestion," she'd say, "to enhance my brand's visual identity." I tried to push back. One evening, after a particularly long and loud phone call with him had bled into our dinner time, I confronted her. "Do you really need to spend this much time with him, Vanessa?" She looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in annoyance. "He's helping me build something incredible, Ethan. You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She sighed, setting her phone down with a martyred air. "Look, Jacob sees my potential. He believes in what I'm doing. I just wish you could see it too." Her words stung, as they were meant to. "This isn't about me not believing in you," I said. "This is about boundaries. He's everywhere, Vanessa. Don't you think it's a little much?" She rolled her eyes, the ultimate gesture of dismissal. "You're being ridiculous. Jacob is a mentor. Nothing more. You need to stop being so insecure." Insecure star. That word became her weapon, a shield she used to deflect any and all criticism of her relationship with him. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was insecure. But it wasn't a simple, jealous insecurity. It was a profound, existential insecurity. It was about the way she lit up when his name appeared on her phone. It was about the way his opinions had become gospel, while mine were treated as the ramblings of a well-meaning, but hopelessly out-of-touch amateur. One night, my brother Liam came over for a beer. I finally vented, the words tumbling out in a torrent of frustration. "He's everywhere, Liam. She acts like he's the answer to all her problems, and I'm just in the way." Liam, a man of few words and deep loyalties, took a long sip of his beer, his eyes thoughtful. "Have you told her, straight up, how you feel?" "I've tried. She just shuts me down. Says I'm being insecure. It's like she's already made up her mind whose opinion matters more." Liam frowned, his gaze steady. "Look, man, you've always been the quiet, supportive type. The rock. But maybe it's time to stop being a rock and start being a roar. She needs to know you're not just a background character in her story. You're supposed to be the co-author. His words stayed with me. For years, I had been the steady, reliable foundation. But I was beginning to realize that a foundation, no matter how strong, is useless if the person you're supporting is determined to build their house on someone else's land. Jacob wasn't just a mentor. He was a wedge, and he was driving us apart with a brutal, deliberate efficiency. And for the first time, I began to wonder if Vanessa even noticed. Or worse, if she simply didn't care. The cracks in our marriage were no longer hairline fissures. They were widening into gaping chasms, and the ground beneath my feet felt increasingly unstable. It wasn't just Jacob anymore. It was the entire ecosystem of deceit and dismissal that had grown up around him. The red flags were no longer subtle whispers of doubt. They were screaming, neon-red sirens, and I could no longer afford to ignore them. The first major detonation occurred at Liam's house. He and his girlfriend, Sarah, had invited a small group of friends for a relaxed dinner party, the kind of easy, low-key evening I desperately craved. Vanessa, however, treated it as just another stop on her endless networking tour. She arrived late, poured into a sleek, fire engine red dress that screamed for attention, and immediately began holding court with Liam's colleagues, people I barely knew. "Your wife's a social butterfly, huh?" one of Liam's friends commented, raising an eyebrow as Vanessa's loud, theatrical laugh echoed from across the room. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. Yeah, something like that. The evening wore on, and I became a ghost at the feast. Every attempt I made to engage with Vanessa was met with a distracted nod or a dismissive wave. It was as if I were speaking a language she no longer understood or had simply lost interest in hearing. I was invisible, a shadow she had grown accustomed to dragging behind her. The real sting came when Jacob's name inevitably surfaced. "Vanessa, you've mentioned that mentor of yours, Jacob, a few times," Sarah said, her tone casual. "Is he as brilliant as you make him sound?" Vanessa's face lit up, a high wattage, almost manic glow. "Oh, he's incredible," she gushed, her voice taking on the familiar, reverent tone she reserved for him. "He's taught me so much about branding, about how to stand out in this ridiculously competitive market. Honestly, I don't know where my career would be without him." I felt my jaw tighten, my grip on my wine glass a white-knuckled thing. Sarah, bless her observant soul, glanced at me, her own smile faltering. "Ethan, what do you think of Jacob?" The conversation pivoted, and suddenly, all eyes were on me. I was on stage, under a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. The words caught in my throat. "I think he's effective," I said finally, the word carefully chosen, stripped of all emotion. Vanessa shot me a look, a quick, sharp glare that was both a warning and a correction. "He's more than effective, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with a patronizing condescension. "He's a visionary." I swallowed the bitter retort that rose in my throat and let the moment pass. But inside I was seething. The red flags kept coming, relentless and brutal. A week later, I came home early from a meeting, a rare occurrence. I walked into the kitchen to find her on the phone, her back to me. Her voice was low, intimate, and laced with a playful, girlish laughter I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "No, Jacob, stop," she was giggling. "You always know how to make me laugh." I cleared my throat. She jumped, spinning around, her eyes wide with a flash of guilt. "I'll call you back," she said hurriedly into the phone, hanging up before I could even register the full scene. "Jacob again?" I asked, setting my briefcase on the counter, the sound a dull thud in the tense silence. She rolled her eyes, the guilt already being replaced by a defensive annoyance. "It was work, Ethan. Don't make it into a thing. It's not work when you're giggling like a teenager, Vanessa." I shot back. Her expression hardened. "You're being ridiculous. He's a friend and a mentor. You need to stop being so paranoid." "Paranoid," I repeated, my voice rising. "He is practically living in our marriage at this point. He's in our house, in our conversations, in your head. Do you even hear yourself?" She just shook her head, grabbing her phone and walking past me. "I don't have time for this." It wasn't just her actions. It was her complete and utter dismissal of my feelings. Every conversation felt like a battle I was destined to lose before it even began. The final, brutal confirmation came from Liam. He pulled me aside during one of our gym sessions, his expression grim. "Look, man, I don't want to stir the pot," he began, his voice low. but people are talking. A cold dread washed over me. What kind of talking? Liam hesitated. About Vanessa and Jacob. Just that they're close. Too close. A few people at the party the other night said they seemed a little overly familiar. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. And no one thought to say anything to me? I'm telling you now, Liam said, his voice firm. You need to figure out what the hell is going on, Ethan, before it's too late. The last straw, the one that finally broke the back of my denial, came a few nights later. Vanessa came home late, well after midnight. As she walked past me in the hallway, I was hit by a wave of expensive cologne. A scent I didn't recognize. A scent that was most definitely not mine. Where were you? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Dinner, she said, kicking off her heels, not meeting my eyes. With Jacob. It was a last-minute strategy thing. I didn't have time to call. I stared at her, at this stranger who wore my wife's face. Vanessa, I said, my chest tight. Do you even care how this looks? How any of this feels to me? She shrugged, a gesture of profound, chilling indifference. I don't know what you want me to say, Ethan. You're overreacting. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't insecure. The red flags were real. They were a burning, undeniable forest fire. But the most painful realization, the one that finally extinguished the last ember of hope, was not what she was doing. It was that she didn't seem to care how much it was destroying me. Something had to change. And for the first time, I began to wonder if that change meant walking away from the wreckage altogether. The realization that Vanessa no longer cared about my feelings wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow, creeping frost, chilling the landscape of our marriage until everything was brittle and dead. It was a truth I had tried to deny, to rationalize, to bargain with, because to admit it felt like admitting the ultimate failure. But there, in the hallway, with the foreign scent of another man's cologne clinging to her, denial was no longer a sustainable option. Something had to change. The turning point, the moment of absolute, irreversible rupture, came on a night I wasn't even supposed to be home. I had a late work meeting, a quarterly review that always ran for hours. But it had been unexpectedly canceled. I drove home, harboring a foolish, naive hope. Maybe a quiet, unplanned evening together could bridge some small part of the vast, silent chasm that had opened between us. I walked through the front door into a house that was not quiet. The sound of her laughter, that specific, unguarded laugh she used to reserve for me, echoed from the living room. It was the sound of a happiness I was no longer a part of. I walked in, and there he was. Jacob. He was sitting on our couch, my couch, his legs crossed, a glass of my best whiskey in his hand, looking for all the world like the lord of the manor. Vanessa sat in the armchair opposite, leaning forward, her face alight, hanging on his every word as if he were delivering a sermon. The moment they saw me, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The easy intimacy curdled into a thick, awkward tension. Ethan, Vanessa said, her voice a little too bright, as she straightened up, a guilty flush creeping up her neck. You're home early. Jacob, ever the master of insincere charm, raised his glass to me with a lazy smirk. Ethan, good to see you, man. Vanessa was just telling me about your latest project. Sounds impressive. I didn't respond. I just stood there, in the doorway of my own living room, feeling like an intruder. It wasn't just that he was there. It was the sheer, unadulterated ease of it all. The way he had so seamlessly inserted himself into the very heart of my life, my home. He didn't see me as a threat. And Vanessa, it seemed, saw nothing wrong with this picture at all. I didn't realize we were having company. I said finally, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Oh, Jacob just stopped by to discuss some work ideas, Vanessa said, the lie flimsy and insulting. At 8 o'clock at night? I shot back, my eyes locked on hers. In our home. Jacob chuckled, a low, condescending sound. He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored blazer. No need to get territorial, Ethan. Vanessa and I have a great working dynamic. It's all business, I assure you. The condescension in his voice was a lit match to a puddle of gasoline. Right? I said through clenched teeth. Because sitting on my couch, drinking my whiskey, and laughing with my wife screams professionalism. He smirked, clearly enjoying the drama he was orchestrating. You're a lucky man, Ethan. Vanessa is one of the most driven, brilliant people I've ever met. The audacity of him, standing in my home, complimenting my wife to my face as if he were the one who had discovered her, was staggering. "I know exactly who my wife is," I said, my voice low and steady. "The question is, do you?" After a few more tense, unbearable moments, Jacob finally made his exit. The moment the door closed behind him, the fragile truce shattered. Vanessa turned on me, her eyes blazing. "You were unbelievable," she hissed. "You were rude. You were hostile. He's my mentor, Ethan. He's a predator, Vanessa, and you're letting him hunt in our house." The argument that followed was the culmination of months of unspoken resentments. She accused me of being paranoid, of being insecure, of trying to sabotage her career. "You need to stop making everything about you," she shouted. "Jacob is helping me build something incredible. Why can't you just support me?" "Support you?" I repeated, my own voice rising to a roar. "Vanessa, I have done nothing but support you. I have sacrificed my time, my energy, my own ambitions for you. I have stood by and watched as you've replaced me with him, with your followers, with this empty, pathetic performance. And all I've gotten in return is disrespect. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to come home and find him sitting here, acting like he owns the place?" Her expression softened, but only for a moment. Her defenses slammed back into place. "I can't control how you feel, Ethan," she said, her voice suddenly cold, detached. "But I will not apologize for pursuing my dreams." "Your dreams," I said, the fight going out of me, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. "And where do I fit into those dreams, Vanessa? Or have you already written me out of the story completely?" Her silence was the only answer I needed. That night, I slept in the guest room. I lay there, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, and I knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was heartbreaking, that it was over. I was done fighting for a marriage that only one of us was in. I was done being the man who always bent to make things work. If she couldn't see my worth, then maybe it was time to show her, and the world, that I was not a man to be dismissed. It was time to take back control of my life. And this time, I wasn't going to play nice. The morning after the final, soul-crushing argument, I woke up with a chilling, unfamiliar clarity. The grief and the anger had not vanished, but they had coalesced into something new, a cold, hard, diamond-like resolve. I was done pleading for her attention. I was done trying to fix a marriage that was, I now realized, irreparably broken. If she wanted to treat me like a side character, a predictable, unsparkling prop in the grand drama of her life, then fine. But I would no longer be a silent one. That day, I began to formulate a plan. The first step was not about her, it was about me. I had to reclaim the man I was before I became subsumed by her world. For too long, my career, my friendships, my very sense of self had taken a back seat to the relentless, all-consuming machine of her brand. I started small. I began reaching out to the people I had let drift away. Old friends from college, former mentors, colleagues I respected. Liam, of course, remained my steadfast anchor. But as I reconnected with others, I was reminded of a life, an identity, that existed independently of Vanessa. They saw me not as her supportive husband, but as Ethan, the sharp, driven consultant, the loyal friend, the man with his own accomplishments and his own worth. For the first time in years, I started to feel like myself again. At work, I threw myself into my projects with a renewed, almost ferocious, focus. I had always been good at what I did, but in the fog of my personal life, my passion had waned. Now, I channeled all my frustration, all my hurt, into my business. I took on new clients, tackled challenging projects, and pushed myself in ways I hadn't in years. Word of my renewed drive began to spread. Opportunities, which had been trickling in, began to flow. A longtime client, impressed with my recent work, introduced me to a high-profile investor who was launching a new tech venture. It was a massive, game-changing project, the kind that could elevate my firm from a successful boutique to a major player. I pursued it with a single-minded determination. All the while, I kept a dispassionate, analytical eye on Vanessa and Jacob, not out of jealousy, but out of a need to understand the full scope of the system I was up against. I attended one of her public events, not as a supportive spouse, but as a corporate anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. And what I saw only confirmed my new, colder perspective. Jacob was there, of course, the ever-present puppet master. He worked the room, his charm a well-oiled machine. Vanessa, dressed to the nines, hung on his every word, her laughter a little too loud, her eyes a little too bright. But this time, watching them, I didn't feel the familiar, gut-wrenching sting of betrayal. I felt a strange, detached pity. She didn't see it. She didn't see that he wasn't her champion. He was her user. Every compliment, every piece of advice, was a carefully placed chess move designed to keep her dependent on him, to feed his own ego, to solidify his control. And she, blinded by her desperate need for external validation, was a willing pawn in his game. Liam, ever the astute observer, articulated what I had already begun to suspect. "You're not just dealing with her ego, Ethan," he said one night over beers. "You're dealing with a classic manipulator. He's playing both of you. He uses her for her status, and he uses your reaction to make himself look like the hero. Don't give him the satisfaction." "I won't," I said, my resolve hardening. "But I'm not just going to sit back and let him win." That's when the plan fully took shape. If Vanessa wanted to align herself with Jacob, I would let her. But it would be on my terms. I would not stoop to his level. I would not engage in petty drama or public confrontations. Instead, I would demonstrate what real power, real influence, looked like. I began to re-establish my presence in the very spaces they thought they owned. I started attending industry events, not as Vanessa's husband, but as Ethan Thorne, founder of Thorne Consulting. At first, Vanessa seemed surprised, then vaguely annoyed, to see me there, assuming I was simply there to keep an eye on her. What she didn't realize was that I was building alliances of my own. I sought out the people in her circle. The brand managers, the investors, the other creatives, who I could see were growing tired of Jacob's arrogance and Vanessa's self-absorption. It didn't take long to find them. The world of influence is small and incestuous, and reputations, both good and bad, travel fast. I didn't gossip. I didn't complain about my marriage. I simply talked business. I offered insights. I demonstrated my value. By the time Vanessa began to notice the shift in the dynamic, it was too late. The conversations at these events were no longer solely about her latest post or Jacob's brilliant new strategy. They were about my new venture, my insights on the market, my growing influence. I wasn't just reclaiming my identity. I was building a new one, a better one. The best part? I never had to raise my voice. I never had to make a scene. My quiet, steady, undeniable success was a louder statement than any angry words could ever be. Vanessa and Jacob may have thought they were the stars of the show, but they were about to learn a hard lesson. Real power doesn't need a spotlight. It generates its own light. And my plan was just getting started. The cracks in Jacob and Vanessa's carefully constructed empire of influence were beginning to show, and I wasn't the only one noticing. The more I moved through their world, not as a wounded husband, but as a quiet, confident peer, the more I saw the flimsy, smoke-and-mirrors nature of their perceived dominance. My plan was not one of overt revenge. It was a slow, methodical reclamation of my own narrative. And it was working. A particularly revealing moment came at a high-profile charity gala. It was the kind of event where appearances were everything. Overpriced cocktails, endless photo ops, and a thick, cloying atmosphere of competitive philanthropy. Vanessa insisted I attend. "It's important for our brand, Ethan," she'd said, the hour feeling like a hollow, contractual obligation. I obliged, not to play the part of the perfect husband, but to take a temperature reading of their world, to identify the stress fractures in Jacob's armor. The night began as expected. Vanessa, a shimmering vision in couture, flitted from group to group, a social hummingbird, while I played my familiar role of silent observer. Then, Jacob arrived, and the energy in the room shifted. He wasn't just arrogant. He was a master of calculated social warfare. He knew how to command attention, how to subtly undermine rivals, how to position himself at the center of every conversation. But as I watched him work the room, I noticed something new. Not everyone was drinking the Kool-Aid. A group of seasoned tech executives near the bar exchanged skeptical, almost amused, glances as Jacob delivered one of his overly rehearsed anecdotes about a deal he'd single-handedly closed. A young, sharp-witted journalist I knew rolled her eyes when he cornered her, attempting to charm her into writing a puff piece. Even some of Vanessa's own friends, her loyal court, seemed less enthralled than usual. Their laughter was a beat too slow, their smiles a little too tight. And then there was Vanessa herself. She played her part, laughing at his jokes, deferring to his opinions. But there was a new tension in her posture, a flicker of something, doubt, weariness, in her eyes that hadn't been there before. For the first time, I wondered if she was starting to see what I had seen all along, that Jacob wasn't a visionary. He was a vampire, feeding on the energy and success of others. The turning point of the evening came when he decided to confront me directly. He sauntered over to where Vanessa and I were standing, a glass of scotch in his hand, that trademark smirk firmly in place. "Ethan," he said, his tone dripping with a false, oily sincerity. "How's business these days?" "Vanessa tells me you've been busy." I smiled, a calm, easy expression, refusing to rise to the bait. "Business is excellent, Jacob. Thanks for asking. The new venture is exceeding all projections." "Good to hear," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Though I imagine it must be tough, keeping up with a force of nature like Vanessa." It was his classic move, a calculated dig designed to establish a hierarchy, with him and Vanessa at the top, and me at the bottom. It might have worked months ago, when I was mired in self-doubt. But not anymore. I've always known Vanessa was a force of nature. I replied, my tone level, pointed. That's why I've never felt the need to compete with her. I'm confident enough in my own work. The subtle jab landed. His smirk faltered for a split second. He glanced at Vanessa, as if expecting her to rush to his defense, to put me back in my place. But she didn't. She just stood there, her expression unreadable, a silent observer in a duel she had not anticipated. The rest of the evening was a study in shifting dynamics. Jacob's confidence had taken a visible hit. Vanessa was quieter, more withdrawn, her usual spark dimmed by a new, unspoken tension. When we got home that night, she finally broke the silence. "You were different tonight," she said, her tone cautious, analytical. "Different how?" I asked, playing dumb. "More assertive," she admitted. "I don't know. It just felt off. Maybe I'm just tired of playing a role," I said, my voice steady. "Maybe it's time I started being the man I've always been, whether you or Jacob like it or not." Her eyes widened slightly, but she offered no reply. She just turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving me alone in the quiet living room. That night, I realized something crucial. Their power over me had never been about their actions. It had been about my reaction. For too long, I had let them define the terms, dictate the narrative. But no more. I wasn't just reclaiming my place in the story. I was rewriting it, word by word. And the next chapter would be entirely mine. The more I pushed forward into my own life, the more Jacob's carefully constructed world began to show its cracks. His power was an illusion, built on a foundation of borrowed credibility and blustering confidence. Once that foundation was tested, the entire edifice began to tremble. Vanessa, whether she was ready to admit it or not, was beginning to feel the tremors. The night after the charity gala, she was uncharacteristically quiet. She, who could not stand a vacuum of silence, now seemed to embrace it. I could see the gears turning in her head, the calculations being run. The way I had handled Jacob, with a quiet confidence rather than an emotional outburst, had unsettled her. It didn't fit the narrative she had created of me as the predictable, insecure husband. "Do you think Jacob is arrogant?" she asked abruptly one evening, her voice softer than I'd heard it in weeks. I set my coffee cup down, meeting her gaze. "Do you really need me to answer that, Vanessa?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's just, he's been so helpful. But lately I feel like," her voice trailed off, "like he's helping himself more than he's helping you." I offered. Her eyes flickered with something. Guilt, perhaps, or simple recognition. I don't know. Maybe. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Vanessa, you're a smart, driven woman. But you have a blind spot for men like Jacob. He doesn't care about you. He cares about what you represent. He cares about the access and the status you provide him." She opened her mouth to argue, a reflexive defense of her own judgment, but then she stopped. For the first time, it seemed like she was actually listening. The cracks in Jacob's reputation were widening, and I wasn't the only one applying the pressure. Liam, ever my loyal source of intel, started hearing things. "Apparently, our boy Jacob isn't as untouchable as he thinks," Liam said over the phone one afternoon. I've heard from a few people in his circle that he's been crossing lines. Professionally and personally. What kind of lines? I asked, though I could guess. The kind that get people talking, Liam replied. Burning bridges with major clients. Taking sole credit for team projects. And there's a persistent rumor about him making an inappropriate pass at a junior colleague. At one of your wife's events, no less. I shook my head, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Jacob wasn't just arrogant. He was reckless. And reckless men, inevitably, become their own executioners. Meanwhile, Vanessa was fighting her own internal battle. Her once unshakable faith in Jacob was clearly wavering. She spent more time at home, less time on the phone with him. When his name did come up, her tone was different, more reserved, analytical, the hero worship gone from her voice. One evening, as we sat in the living room, a rare moment of shared, uncomplicated silence between us, she turned to me. Do you think I've been too trusting? Of Jacob? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Of people in general, she said, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. I wanted to succeed so badly. I wanted to build something real. And you thought he was the key to that, I said. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. I thought he believed in me. I wanted to tell her that his belief was a transaction, a currency he used to buy loyalty. But she needed to get there on her own. Instead, I said, belief is cheap, Vanessa. Respect is what matters. And I'm not sure Jacob respects anyone but himself. Her doubts about him grew, but so did his desperation. As he felt her pulling away, his attempts to tighten his grip became more frantic, more transparent. He started showing up at her office unannounced. He'd call her at all hours, making flimsy excuses about urgent business. The more she resisted, the harder he pushed. One night, she came to me, her face a mask of troubled confusion. He showed up at my office again today, she said. He wanted to talk strategy, but it just felt wrong. He was too close, too intense. Did you tell him to leave? I asked. I tried, she admitted. But he just laughed it off. He wouldn't take the hint. I took a deep breath, the familiar bubble of frustration rising in my chest. Vanessa, you need to draw a hard line. This man is not your savior. He is a parasite. And if you don't cut him off, he will drain you dry. She didn't respond. But the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She knew I was right. Jacob was unraveling. And she was finally, belatedly, seeing him for the man he truly was. The damage he had done, to her reputation and to our marriage, was immense. But the inevitable confrontation was looming. And this time, I wasn't just going to stand by and watch it play out. If Jacob wanted to force his way back into my life, he was about to find out exactly what I was capable of. Jacob's grip on Vanessa was slipping, and his desperation was making him sloppy. The signs were everywhere. The frantic, late-night texts she now openly ignored. The overly familiar voicemails she'd play for me with a roll of her eyes. The way his practiced charm had curdled into a needy, insistent pressure. He was a man losing control, and he didn't know how to handle it. Vanessa, to her credit, was finally building a wall. It wasn't the fortress of defiance I would have built, but it was a start. Small, hesitant acts of resistance that signaled she was finally seeing through his facade. One evening, she came home from work looking pale and shaken. She dropped her bag on the counter and poured herself a large glass of wine before saying a word. I was at the kitchen table, going over invoices for my firm. Jacob was at the office again, she said finally, her voice quiet, frayed. I looked up from my laptop, my own expression carefully neutral. And she hesitated, staring into her glass as if it held the answers. He made a pass at me. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A surge of white-hot, primitive anger rose in my chest, but I forced it down. An emotional outburst now would only muddy the waters. I needed to be calm. I needed to be strategic. What, exactly? I asked, my voice dangerously steady. Did he do? He said he wanted to take our partnership to the next level, she said, the word partnership dripping with disgust. He tried to kiss me. When I pulled away and told him he was crossing a line, he got defensive. He said I was misunderstanding his intentions, that I was being overly dramatic. Vanessa, I said, leaning forward. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is who he is. This is who he has been all along. She looked at me, her eyes a turbulent mix of conflict and exhaustion. I don't know how I let it get this far. Because he's good at what he does, I said. He manipulates people. He makes them feel like they need him. But you don't owe him anything, Vanessa. Not your career, not your loyalty, and certainly not your dignity. For once, she didn't argue. She just nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the full, crushing weight of her misjudgment had finally landed on her. The days that followed were a tense, waiting game. Vanessa avoided his calls, but he wasn't the type to take no for an answer. He started leaving voicemails, each one more insistent, more unhinged than the last. "You're making a mistake, Vanessa," he'd plead in one. "We have something special, and I won't let you throw it away because of your insecure husband." The final, inevitable confrontation came when he decided to bypass her and come directly to me. I was in my office, wrapping up a call, when my assistant buzzed. "There's a visitor for you, Ethan. He says his name is Jacob. He doesn't have an appointment, and he's being persistent." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Send him in." The door opened, and there he was. He strode in as if he owned the building, a caricature of arrogant entitlement. He didn't bother to shake my hand. He didn't greet me. He walked straight to my desk, sank into the client chair, and propped his expensive, Italian leather-shod feet up on the polished wood. "Ethan," he said, that infuriating smirk plastered on his face. "We need to talk." I leaned back in my own chair, crossing my arms, my face a blank slate. About Vanessa," he said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing a business acquisition. "She's clearly torn between us, and I think it's time we settled this." Like men, I stared at him, my expression unreadable. "Go on." He leaned forward, the smirk widening. "You're not enough for her, Ethan. You never have been. She needs someone who can match her ambition, her drive. Someone like me." The anger was a low, simmering fire in my gut, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled. A cold, deliberate, humorless smile that made his own falter for just a second. "And what do you propose?" I asked, my voice calm. He shrugged, spreading his hands in a gesture of magnanimity. "It's simple. Step aside. Gracefully. Let her be with someone who can give her what she really wants." For a long, silent moment, I said nothing. I let the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his words hang in the air. Then I stood up. I walked around the desk until I was standing directly in front of him, looking down at him. "You have some nerve," I said quietly, my voice laced with a steel he had clearly not anticipated. He opened his mouth to respond, to deliver another witty, condescending barb, but before he could, I leaned in, my face inches from his. "Get out of my office," I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. "And if you ever show your face here, or near my wife, or near my home again, you will not be walking out." His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, and then, for the first time, uncertainty. He scrambled to his feet, straightening his jacket, a reflexive attempt to regain some semblance of his shattered composure. "You'll regret this, Ethan," he said, the threat sounding hollow and weak. "Not as much as you will," I replied, watching as he turned and walked, with significantly less swagger, out of my office. When the door closed behind him, I sat back down, my hands trembling with a rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time, I felt like I was the one finally taking the fight to him. And this time, I had no intention of losing. The fallout from my confrontation with Jacob was a swift and predictable chain reaction. A man like him, whose entire identity was built on a foundation of perceived dominance, does not react well to being challenged. He thought his arrogance was a weapon. He was about to discover it was his greatest vulnerability. The next day, Vanessa came home looking like a ghost. Her usual polished, camera-ready exterior was gone. There was no perfectly styled hair, no flawless makeup. She was just Vanessa, raw, exhausted, and visibly shaken. "What's going on?" I asked, setting my laptop aside. She hesitated, hovering by the kitchen counter as if afraid to come closer. "Jacob," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "He's spreading rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That I'm unstable. That I was using him to climb the ladder. He's telling people I came on to him, that I was obsessed with him, and that he had to cut ties." I leaned back, a cold, familiar anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "And people are believing him." "Some are," she admitted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He's so good at twisting things, at making himself look like the victim. She finally looked at me, her expression a turbulent mix of guilt and desperation. I thought if I just cut him out, he'd go away. But he's trying to destroy me. I stood up and crossed the room to stand in front of her. Vanessa, this is what he does. He manipulates, he lies, and he tries to destroy anyone who doesn't give him exactly what he wants. But you are not going to fight this alone. She looked up at me, surprise and gratitude warring on her face. Why? Why are you still standing by me, after everything? Because I know who he really is, I said firmly. And because, despite everything that has happened between us, I am not going to stand by and watch you fall apart because of him. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Jacob's campaign of character assassination spread through their professional circles like a virus. Clients began to pull out of collaborations with Vanessa. Some of her so-called friends, the ones who had flocked to her when she was on the rise, now distanced themselves, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. It was a brutal, ugly lesson in the fickle nature of the world she had so desperately wanted to conquer. But Jacob wasn't just targeting her. Liam called me one afternoon, his voice tense. Ethan, I just heard from a source at Jacob's firm. He's trying to discredit you, too. Of course he is, I said, not surprised. What's he saying? That you're jealous, insecure, that you're trying to sabotage his career because you can't handle Vanessa's success. He's painting you as the villain who drove them apart. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. Typical. What are you going to do? Liam asked. I'm going to let him dig his own grave, I replied. His arrogance is his greatest weakness, and it's only a matter of time before he makes a fatal mistake. I began to gather my own intelligence. I compiled every email, every text, every voicemail that showed his inappropriate, manipulative behavior. Vanessa, to her credit, handed over everything she had, her own archive of his deceit. We were no longer husband and wife in that moment. We were allies in a war against a common enemy. But it wasn't just about exposing him. It was about rebuilding what he had tried to destroy. I began to quietly reach out to some of Vanessa's key clients, the ones who had paused their collaborations. I didn't make excuses for her, but I vouched for her professionalism, and I explained the context of Jacob's smear campaign. Some were skeptical, but others, who had their own quiet reservations about Jacob, were surprisingly supportive. I've been waiting for someone to stand up to that guy, one influential so told me. He's been an untouchable bully for too long. The turning point, the fatal mistake I had been waiting for, came from within his own company. A young junior employee, the same one Liam had mentioned weeks ago, emboldened by the rumors and the visible cracks in Jacob's armor, filed a formal harassment complaint against him. It was the break we needed. Suddenly, his allies began to scatter. The company launched a full-scale internal investigation. His carefully constructed image began to crumble under the harsh light of scrutiny. Vanessa and I watched it all unfold, not with glee, but with a sense of grim vindication. She had been burned by him, and I had been pushed to my limit. But now, the truth was finally, unstoppably, coming to light. One evening, as we sat on the couch, a rare, quiet moment in the midst of the chaos, she turned to me. I don't know if I can ever fix what I've broken between us, she said softly. But I want you to know, I am so sorry. For everything. I nodded, the weight of her words settling in my chest. I appreciate that, Vanessa. But this isn't just about us anymore. This is about making sure that men like Jacob don't get to win. She nodded, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. Thank you, Ethan, she whispered, for standing by me, even when I didn't deserve it. I didn't respond. I just looked out the window, at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt like we were finally on the same side. And that, I realized, was the first real step toward healing. The dust, when it finally settled, left a landscape that was irrevocably altered. Jacob's empire, built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, had not just crumbled, it had been razed to the ground. The formal harassment complaint acted as a catalyst, emboldening others to come forward. The internal investigation unearthed a pattern of misconduct that was as shocking as it was systemic. He was fired, his reputation in tatters, a pariah in the industry he had once so arrogantly dominated. Vanessa and I watched his downfall from a distance. There was no celebration, no sense of triumphant victory. Her own career had been damaged, her judgment called into question. The affair, even an emotional one, had left scars that wouldn't easily fade. But there was a quiet sense of vindication, a relief that the truth had finally prevailed. As for me, I had emerged from the crucible a different man. The quiet, accommodating husband who had allowed himself to be relegated to the background was gone. In his place was a man who knew his own worth, who was not afraid to fight for his dignity, who had found his own voice in the deafening noise of his wife's ambitions. Our marriage, however, was a casualty of the war. We had fought on the same side at the end, but the damage was too deep, the trust too thoroughly shattered, to simply go back to the way things were. I don't know what happens next, Vanessa admitted one evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining room table, the space between us filled with a new, more honest kind of silence. I don't know if we can ever go back. I looked at her, at the woman I had loved, the woman who had hurt me, the woman who was now, finally, seeing the world without the distorting filter of her own ambition. Maybe we're not supposed to go back, Vanessa, I said, the words feeling true and right. Maybe we're supposed to figure out who we are now, as individuals, before we can even begin to think about if there's an us left. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes filling with tears. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we were finally speaking the same language. In the weeks that followed, we began the slow, painful process of untangling our lives. It was a quiet, respectful separation. I focused on myself, on my work, on rebuilding the parts of my life I had neglected. I threw myself into the new venture with the investor, and it was a roaring success, solidifying my reputation as a major player in my field. I made time for friends, for family, for the quiet, simple things that had been lost in the chaos. One evening, Liam convinced me to attend a community fundraiser, a low-key event at a local art gallery. I went, not expecting much, but it felt good to be out, to be surrounded by people who knew nothing of the drama I had just survived. That's where I met Hannah. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't a brand. She was a landscape architect, a woman with dirt under her fingernails and a quiet, warm smile. She had a genuine curiosity about the world, and about me, that was utterly devoid of artifice. We started talking about something simple, her love for native plants, my interest in urban design, and the conversation just flowed. It was easy. It was real. The night ended with a simple handshake and a promise to get coffee sometime. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment, but it felt more significant than any of the high-drama scenes of the past year. It felt like hope. As I drove home that night, I thought about Vanessa, about Jacob, about the wreckage and the rebuilding. The scars were still there. They would always be a part of my story. But they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of a storm I had weathered, of a battle I had fought, and, in my own way, won. I didn't know what the future held, with my work, with Hannah, with my life. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. I finally knew exactly who I was. And that was more than enough.